Growing up for me was like a mix of The Sopranos and The Crown, because you see, my father was a villain, or a gangster in American parlance. He and my mother were determined to make their children's upbringing better than their own, and a good education was seen as the best route for that. As a result, I was educated alongside and socialized with the rich, the famous, and the aristocratic. Now, most of my friends never found out that the men who drove me and my siblings to school in the Silver Shadow Rolls-Royce were actually bodyguards. And needless to say, I never, ever talked to my friends or their parents about my father's work projects. My father had an imposing, intimidating stature, a boxer's stature. He had, after all, been taught bare-knuckle fighting by his father, and they were both champions in and out of the ring. My father could end a discussion and occasionally start one with a single swift left hook to the jaw. In fairness, my father was more than just muscle and Neanderthal urges. He was exceedingly smart, funny, and charming. He was also a great family man who would die for his children and his wife. It was often said when I was growing up, God help any bloke that wants to take the girls out. They're going to have to get past Charlie, and I don't reckon their chances. As the years went on, my father had to change his line of work. The 50s were a free-for-all, but the mid-60s saw the Cray brothers increasing notoriety, and as a result, their fall, and things had to change. So the violence and tensions of my father's earlier career path lessened greatly, and he mellowed. That said, a leopard doesn't change its spots, and having been warned in my youth about how my father might be with potential suitors, I tended to keep them away from the house. When I was 23, I started dating a young man, and after nearly a year, I introduced Andrew, my boyfriend, to my parents. The meeting was civil, and my father said very little. He had learnt to communicate differently to me, his precocious and somewhat, some might say, haughty daughter. The months went by, and my father continued to say very little. He let us holiday in the family apartment in Spain and seemed to accept that we were a couple, even though Andrew was not exactly what my father had hoped for me. Andrew was, now how can I put this, a little dull. He was an accountant type, what my family called a grey person, who blended awkwardly in the dysfunctional but colourful and loving home I was brought up in. Then one Sunday, when my other siblings were elsewhere and Andrew was not in attendance, after a particularly delicious Sunday roast lamb, my father asked me a question. So, when are you and Andrew going to get married? I don't know. I don't know that I want to get married to Andrew. Well, how long have you been dating him? He asked. My mother rose from the table and started to clear. It was just my father and myself now. Over 2 years, 2 years and 3 months. Where is he going with this, I wondered. Well, I think it's time you got married, my father replied. Daddy, I told you, I don't want to get married. Oh, come on, give your old man something to look forward to. We haven't had a party in ages, and I fancy walking you down the aisle. He rose from the table and got a pad of paper and pen before resuming his place in the wide carver dining table. Let's work it out, he said. Let's say 100 people. Andrew can have, what, 10 guests? I mean, he hasn't got many friends, has he? Daddy, that's not fair. Okay, let's say 20 for Andrew, max. My father proceeded to speak out a list of family friends, old friends, and my friends to add to the list. The estimated number was now 160. Let's see if we can have this at the Savoy. I fancy the River Room. For the last few years, we'd spent Christmas at the Savoy, having lunch and spending the day there to save my mother from the drudgery of Christmas lunch. My dad jumped up and called directory inquiries. So remember, we're talking about 1986 now, long before cell phones and the internet. Can you put me through to the Savoy, love? Once connected, he got through to someone in the function suites department, even though I'd protested that no one would be there on a Sunday. My father and the person on the other end of the phone had a short discussion about chicken, beef, and vegetarian options, and ascertained that it would be £30 a head and maybe an extra £2,000 for an open bar. What does that add up to, he asked. £6,800 plus room hire, I replied. Room hire, wedding dress, bridesmaids' dresses, flowers, cake, church, cars, invitations were all estimated and added to the calculation. He had thought of every detail, adding that I had to fund my own hen night myself. My father was excited and animated and perhaps had wanted a wedding after all. Perhaps he really did want to walk me down the aisle. And by now, I was rather enjoying the idea of it too. And so finally, a total was arrived at. It could be anything from 30 to 40 grand, realistically, I said. And with that, my dad got up and went to the fridge and opened a bottle of champagne. We're gonna have a wedding, he announced as he poured us all a glass. But Daddy, I don't want a wedding. Well, I'll give you 30 grand to elope then. I was now pulling myself out of the rose-tinted fantasy and getting irritated with the focus on my relationship. Well, you may want a wedding, I said defiantly to my father, but I don't want to marry Andrew. He looked at me. So why the fuck are you dating him? My father said, confrontationally, with the same power and force he usually used for others. I reeled. I didn't have an answer. He'd got me. He'd taken me to the point of revelation and beyond. Every time I saw Andrew after that, I thought, why the hell am I going out with you? I thought it even when I wasn't with him. Andrew's knockout punch from my father was delivered when he wasn't even in the room and no blood was spilt. My father never did walk me down the aisle. Some 7 weeks after the conversation, my father died suddenly. When I think of that one conversation, so masterfully set up, I know how much my father loved me and cared for me and understood me even more than I understood myself.